Tonight's presentation is the first in our 2022-23 season, and it is also the Phyllis R. Blakely Memorial Lecture. Many in the audience this evening will not remember the late Phyllis Blakely, a noted provincial historian, biographer, and archivist. A graduate of Dalhousie, she joined the Public Archives of Nova Scotia in 1945 and rose to become provincial archivist in 1982. She was the first woman to hold that position in what was then a traditionally male-dominated profession. In 1978, she was appointed to the Order of Canada for having served her province for over 30 years, devoting herself particularly to the preservation of its cultural heritage. Dr. Blakely also held honorary degrees from Dalhousie and St. Mary's, and in 1979 was made a Fellow of the Royal Nova Scotia Historical Society. Following her death in 1986, the Society instituted the annual Phyllis R. Blakely Memorial Lecture, honoring her legacy of scholarship, 4 books and countless articles, her leadership in archives, her support for women embarking on cultural heritage careers, and her belief in the value of our past in understanding our present. Our presenter this evening continues in this tradition of women as integral contributors to history matters. Jennifer VanderBurgh is Associate Professor in the Department of English Language, and Literature at St. Mary's University, where she teaches courses on film, television, media, and cultural memory. The title of her lecture is Activating an Archive, Margaret Perry's Nova Scotia Promotional Films. It forms part of a week of screenings, exhibitions, and special events marking the new digital release of over 50 films made between 1945 and 1969 by Perry in her capacity as a Nova Scotia government filmmaker. The films are complex artifacts that articulate and reflect understandings of government policies and cultural discourses, as well as Perry's own perspectives and artistic voice. Professor VanderBurgh has been working to activate this collection housed at the Nova Scotia Archives. Her research reframes and animates these government films and encourages us to expand our understandings of their significance. This evening's lecture will introduce the collection and the process of activating it, as well as the discovery of new materials that bring more information to light about Perry's artistic development and filmmaking practice. Her presentation will additionally consider some of the ethical complexities and considerations at stake in reviving this collection today. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jennifer VanderBurgh.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. What a beautiful introduction. It's kind of strange to hear yourself being introduced like that. I'm like, she sounds kind of awesome, actually. She sounds amazing. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming out tonight. It's really wonderful to share this evening with you. Hello to people who are watching on Eastlink on Podium TV, and to those who are watching the live stream of the talk. Hi, Dad in Creemore. I think you are there. So it's really great to be with all of you, whether synchronously or asynchronously, and to have this opportunity to share with you some of the research and some of the activation projects that we're developing around a particular archival collection that contributes to our historical understandings of this province. And I also want to thank Sarah Hollett-Rimmer and the Royal Nova Scotia Historical Society for the invitation to share my research with you. I am a huge fan of Sarah's graduate research on the Nova Scotia Travel Bureau, and it's an extra special invitation because of that. It's also an extra special invitation because Sarah's grandfather, Reg Hollett, worked with Margaret Perry, helping her in a bunch of different capacities actually in her films, did a lot of lighting with her. And so he was an active participant in this archive that we've been activating. So there's a really nice family connection with Sarah's family and the Perry archive. And what an absolute pleasure it is to deliver this talk in the context of this year's Phyllis Blakely Memorial Lecture, a lecture that recognizes and honors the career work of provincial archivist and writer, prolific writer, Phyllis Blakely, who, like Margaret Perry, was a trailblazer in her field and interested in such a wide variety of topics related to Nova Scotia history. Margaret Perry made over 50 films and 70 photo illustrated articles on Nova Scotia topics. And in addition to being an archivist, Phyllis Blakely contributed, among the many things that you heard of in the introduction, over 30 biographies to the Dictionary of Canadian Biography. In Perry's journal from 1938, she includes this rare self-portrait that's also an early experiment in her photo developing. At this time, she was taking photographs, and she had turned a bathroom in her house into a dark room, and she was taking photos by day, and then while her child slept at night or whenever he would sleep, she would go and develop photographs. And so she includes this rare self-portrait in her diary, and she captions it, writing that it looks as though she's come back from beyond. This idea that what we write, what we make, speaks long after we've passed is the inspiration for the title of the interpretive exhibition that my colleague Carla Taunton and I created to introduce people to Margaret Perry. And it's up and running until the end of the month at the Nova Scotia Archive, where Blakely dedicated her career. She started working at the archive as a researcher in 1945, the very same year that Margaret Perry began at the Nova Scotia Film Bureau. So certainly both Perry and Blakely's legacies are very much alive in Nova Scotia, and it's an honor to bring them both together at the archive and to celebrate both of them with you tonight. As Stuart Hall, the great cultural theorist, once said, "The past cannot speak except through its archive." But as Phyllis Blakely knew well, the past doesn't just speak when we take something and we preserve it in an archive. What archivists know is that when we put something into an archive, that's really only the beginning. Archives and archivists select materials to preserve, so that's a curatorial gesture, but it's up to researchers and scholars, as well as other members of the public who engage with archival materials to activate things that we think are important and that resonate with us at various times and in different ways. That's what research is. So in researching and writing about archival collections, we make arguments about their significance and what these materials might say or witness about the past. And these things change over time. We frame archival collections in ways that give them context and relevance in the present. This is something that Phyllis Blakely understood in her work as provincial archivist, and that our current provincial archivist and director of Nova Scotia Archives, Patty Bannister, in continuing this legacy, recognizes as well. And Patty can't be with us tonight because she's busy teaching students how to become archivists and contributing even more in that way. But I want to begin tonight by recognizing with gratitude provincial archivist and director of Nova Scotia Archives, Patty Bannister, and her absolutely incredible team, who help facilitate the research that I'm presenting tonight and that so many others are doing in the province. In particular, I want to acknowledge John McLeod, manager and archivist at Nova Scotia Archives, and archivists Rosemary Barbour and the wonderful audiovisual archivist and my friend, Barry Smith, who have been with me deep in the minutiae of this project every step of the way. So thank you so much to all of you and the work that you do on the daily and on our behalf to continue Phyllis Blakely's legacy in archiving Nova Scotia history, and to work so closely and support researchers like me who are working with the collections that you're preserving. I've worked with archives across Canada, and I know I am not alone in saying that Nova Scotia Archives is really exceptional in its access that it gives researchers, in its responsiveness to the times, and its incredible generosity of spirit. So this talk is part of a 3-night showcase of screenings, exhibitions, and art installations developed in collaboration with the Pan-Canadian research project Archive Counter Archive, with Nova Scotia Archives and the Atlantic International Film Festival to mark the new digital release of over 50 films made by Margaret Perry for the Nova Scotia Film Bureau. Between 1945 and 1969, Margaret Perry was essentially Nova Scotia's government filmmaker. As head of the Film Bureau, her job was to tell the world about Nova Scotia. And in that role, she made and oversaw the production of over 50 promotional films about the province. These short films, shot on Kodachrome and Ektachrome film stock, depict the province as a tourist destination, a natural environment, a site of industrial, agricultural, and artistic production, as well as a complex site of cultural heritage. Aimed at educating Nova Scotians about themselves and promoting the province within Canada and around the world, these films were shown at tourism and trade shows, as well as in schools, and eventually on television. Some of them traveled around the world, winning international awards. Most of these films are instructional and explanatory in nature, almost archival themselves in demonstrating, documenting, and explaining how to make things and how to make things work. A male voice of God narrator, which was conventional at the time, speaking in a mid-Atlantic accent, as I found an accent that's completely made up, right? The bluefin tuna, right? Or the white whale, this interesting accent that people learned in order to signal prestige. This is the accent that's performed by the narrator in all of these films. So at the time that these are government films, they were also produced under the consistent direction of one person, right? Nova Scotia government filmmaker, Margaret Perry. So some of the film's topics were suggested to Perry by various government departments, and some reflect Perry's own interests that we now know she fought very hard to produce. The result is a collection of films that both reflects government interests and initiatives, as well as those of a progressive white settler filmmaker who was deeply curious, interested in nature and the outdoors, in people's labor and how things were made, in community cooperation, and in day-to-day aspects of everyday life. As a result, as well as being an archival collection, these films are archival in nature, since they document aspects of life in Nova Scotia that others at the time didn't think was important and didn't think was worth paying attention to. So tonight I want to introduce you to this film collection that lives in its physical form just up the street, a couple blocks away at the Public Archives of Nova Scotia. And I want to share with you the ongoing story of activating it, which from the point of view of a researcher, really means to make it come alive, to frame it in ways that helps us to understand what makes it relevant, what makes it continue to resonate and connect in various ways with the present moment. Why hold on to archives of physical matter, if not because they continue to matter, right? It's up to us to say how. So tonight's talk is part of the library's History Matters lecture series, and so I want to use the literal and figurative meaning of that title as inspiration, as a way into presenting what we've been doing on our research project for 5 years now in activating, researching, and studying Margaret Perry's Nova Scotia Film Bureau films. I want to think about the matters, concepts, and issues that the process of working with historical materials raises in determining why something matters. And also the concept of archives as matter, as something physical. These films and research materials that we've been working with are material things inside and outside of archives that need to be physically brought together and put into a conversation, as well as cared for, framed, and migrated forward. Here's an image of the Perry film collection as physical matter hanging out in the cold vault at Nova Scotia Archives in its original format on 16mm medium. And here it is again at Nova Scotia Archives in its migrated forward incarnation from the late 1980s on VHS tape. And here's an image of some of the films getting ready to be transported to Kingston. There's Barry and me with just a fraction of the collection that we took there. And that we drove all the way to Kingston and back, delivered to the Vulnerable Media Lab. And here they are. This is my friend and colleague, Susan Lord, who started the Vulnerable Media Lab at Queen's University, where she received these films and started the digitization process. And here's an image of some of the physical materials in the Margaret Perry family collection. Leanna, I probably should have told you that I was going to show a picture of your kitchen table with us stuff. It doesn't usually look like this. Leanna's house is impeccable, but this was journals, scrapbooks, photographs, right? Physical materials in Margaret Perry's family collection. Physical matter that, as it turns out, was absolutely essential for us to learn about Perry's early development as an artist, as a photographer, and then a filmmaker. Some films that we're going to see later on too. And here's another image from another physical archive that we've just discovered that exists at our National Archive, Library and Archives Canada. We only learned about this recently. This is an archive of correspondence that Margaret Perry had for years with producers of Crawley Films, a production company based in Ottawa that did the sound recording, animation, and some of the post-production for Perry's films. The physical materials involved in this research project have been dispersed, found inside official archives in 3 provinces, as well as in unofficial archives in personal or family collections. So this is really a story of how physical things coming together informs and amplifies each other and teaches us things about the past. So even though we're celebrating the digital release of the Perry film collection this week, and all that this signals for new accessibility of these films for viewing and for study and for research, this process has been made possible by the preservation and discovery of physical things. Bringing things physically together that were once separate intellectually activates this archive of films that has always been well preserved and cared for just up the road at the archives. But without these other materials to help us to understand these films, their production, their context, the development of the artist who created them, they just become objects that are taking up space. It's important to remember, especially in a time of freewheeling digitization and digital utopian rhetoric, that matter really matters in any argument about why history matters. So I want to begin tonight by showing you the first opening sequence of a film that made me fall in love with Margaret Perry's work, and that started the process of championing her work as a filmmaker and activating this collection. This also started with something physical, a physical feeling. It was 2010 at a lunchtime screening of films that was part of what was then referred to or then called the Film Studies Association of Canada. And this was a conference that was held, an annual conference, but it was held that year at Concordia University. And the film was called Roads to Reading, a film made in 1958 about the Nova Scotia Library's bookmobile service, brand new bookmobile service that they were launching at the time. So it's very fitting that we're watching a bit of this film here in the Central Library tonight. And so the film was curated as part of a program to launch a new database, a wonderful database created by Charles Ackland and Louis Pelletier of Canadian educational, sponsored, and industrial, so non-theatrical promotional films that they had found in archives all across Canada. So this database was a way to kind of bring them all together so people could search and find out where they were. Most of these films had conventions that you'd expect of the period. These, male voice of God narrators giving didactic, informational accounts of how things worked, or explanations of why things are the way they are. With Roads to Reading in the program, though, I was struck by a few things. First of all, the saturated color, as you'll see, of the images shot on Kodachrome and Ektachrome film stock, these rich, beautiful, beautiful colors. The fact that it represented Nova Scotia, a Nova Scotia that I was familiar with, but that seemed different. It seemed to me that the style of shooting included a lot of close-ups of people that created a sort of intimacy uh, with the film. It also documented a way of exchanging information, taking books from town to town that didn't exist anymore in the same way. It focused on the labor of women and actually framing what women did as labor, working as librarians, circulating, cataloging, and repairing books, helping with research. It seemed to me to be focusing on things that other films wouldn't have paid attention to in such detail. Its articulation of the modern was out of date. So in saying how things were, it was actually showing me how much of the present moment was not this. But at the same time, there were connections with the present. I was struck by how much of the conversation about having access to high-speed internet in the province was actually very much about this, about arguments that having access to information, that what we read relates to ideas about agency and power and progress. These kinds of arguments about access and connectivity are still very much alive and very much relevant in the province. So here's the opening sequence. I'll show you just a couple of moments from Roads to Reading, the first Margaret Perry film that I fell in love with. And it was made in 1958.
In many rural areas of Nova Scotia, Bookmobile Day is a red letter day. For in the books that it carries, the bookmobile brings adventure, travel, and new worlds to explore. So young and old alike wait impatiently for the bookmobile as it travels along its scheduled route. To the children, the bookmobile is their own library, with their own special librarian in charge. To the older folk, having a wide selection of books from which to choose is a dream come true.
So when I first encountered this film, I was surprised and almost shocked to see Margaret Perry's name at the end of it in the credits. The narrator of the film led me to believe that the film was made by a man. I was surprised to learn that it was Margaret Perry who wrote the script, as well as pitched the idea, as well as shot the film, edited the film, and supervised its post-production. And when I found out that Margaret Perry did this over 50 times, I was really shocked that I hadn't heard of her. I later learned that while Perry's career was more prolific than most, there were actually a higher proportion of women than you'd think working in non-theatrical cinema genres like promotional film, more so than in other cinematic genres. Film scholar Marcia Gordon makes the point that historically, non-theatrical cinema genres such as promotional film have been denigrated in relation to narrative genres and theatrical cinema, the kind of film that makes it into theaters. This has meant that a higher proportion of women have been able to pursue cinematic careers in non-theatrical media production. It's not as sexy or as desirable as the narrative film industry, but their work also tends to be ignored and forgotten, since this isn't the type of film that's typically valued. Marcia Gordon makes the further point that since film and media scholarship has historically tended to also devalue this work, non-theatrical media studies is still a relatively underexplored area of film scholarship. So Gordon encourages researchers in the film community to activate archival collections of non-theatrical cinema works of the past. And so that's what we've done. But Perry's films haven't been ignored by scholars and researchers because she's a woman. In fact, the fact that she's a woman has actually garnered her some attention. Perry has been identified in some circles as a prolific and pioneering woman filmmaker. Her films, though, have been stigmatized as vehicles of government promotion. Until recently, very little attention has been paid to Margaret Perry's government films, which have been dismissed, often without having been seen, on assumptions that they were vehicles of propaganda and on charges of promoting folksy, anti-modern depictions of Nova Scotia that were intended to attract out-of-province tourism and business partnerships. These are government films, there's no doubt. But as I started watching these films, I was also struck by some of their progressive ideas for the time. They foreground cooperative labor, women's labor, as I've mentioned, and also lots of different kinds of labor that wasn't valued at the time. They foreground change, development, as well as focusing on aspects of Nova Scotia heritage that others up until that point had ignored. I was struck by the archival nature of these films, as I mentioned, the way that they document knowledge, how things are made, how things are done that has otherwise disappeared. These are promotional films, but they're not only promotional films. As Sylvia Hamilton, one of our great Nova Scotia filmmakers, first observed and pointed out, Margaret Perry's films are also documentaries. Any documentary is a representation, and René Magritte's famous treachery of images, Ceci n'est pas un pipe, reminds us that art is always representation. This painting is not a pipe. It's a representation of a pipe. There's a difference. The pipe that it represents has been mediated through the medium of paint. It's been framed and rendered through the eyes and hands and the perspective of an artist. So Margaret Perry's films are not actuality. They are representations of actuality, but all films are, all art is. So as with all texts, these films also remember and record inadvertent things that the Nova Scotia government and Margaret Perry didn't intend, which I think is also why they're so valuable. Discourses and cultural narratives of the time, views of the landscape and the built environment that have since disappeared, technologies and practices that are no longer used. They also document absences in representation, in the recording of knowledges, and in understandings of the province's formation. Viewing and framing the films this way, I started to think of a couple of things. One, that the collection is useful today as a record that articulates and documents not the way things were, but ways of seeing Nova Scotia that reflects government policies, lived experiences and practices, as well as located perspectives and narratives that were dominant at the time. These films give us insight into how the province was attempting to portray itself in a post-war world. Watching these films prompts questions about what kinds of representations are present and absent in this government-sponsored archive of post-war Nova Scotia. And two, I was thinking that while these films are technically government productions, they also reflect the artistic vision of Margaret Perry, the filmmaker and producer, who, as head of Nova Scotia's Film Bureau, had a hand in all aspects of their production. So as my friend and colleague and collaborator in running the Atlantic Canada Studies program at St. Mary's, Alexander McLeod, who is here tonight, is fond of saying, it is possible to hold two or more competing ideas in your head at the same time. So this archive is a collection of government films. It's also the career work of a pioneering artist and filmmaker. It's both a reflection of the dominant and powerful perspectives of the time and an attempt to intervene within them. So in answer to the question of how to activate this archive, this group of films that was being ignored, I decided the answer was to start to reframe them. And the opportunity arose when I was asked to collaborate on a 6-year pan-Canadian research project directed by Janine Marchessault at York University called Archive Counter Archive, Activating Canada's Moving Image Heritage. And this project brings together scholars, artists, curators, some of which are in this room, and educators from across the country to identify and then to mitigate some of the pressing concerns facing vulnerable moving image collections that are housed both inside and outside of archives. The project is guided by 8 case studies of collections from across Canada that for different reasons are considered vulnerable, and the Margaret Perry film collection is one of them. A lot of the case studies on the project are vulnerable for reasons that you might expect, because the collections aren't housed in archives or because they are counter-archival in nature. So in the first case, collections may be physically deteriorating or facing format obsolescence and need to be migrated forward. In the second case, collections that are counter-archival may either resist or don't fit in well with traditional archives or heritage institutions because they're more ephemeral types of collections maybe, or because they challenge or run counter to existing heritage discourses, so they don't belong in those institutions. Unlike other collections on the project, Margaret Perry's collection wasn't vulnerable because it wasn't well cared for. It was, in fact, well looked after and preserved in good condition at Nova Scotia Archives. The argument, though, was that this was a vulnerable collection because of a PR problem. The fact that this was a collection of government film encouraged people to dismiss the collection as propaganda or promoting anti-modern depictions of Nova Scotia. So although I think this isn't particularly true, the films were being dismissed without ever having been seen in some cases, which ended up creating a cycle wherein they weren't getting watched and then they weren't getting written about, which ended up making the collection more and more vulnerable, generating more and more disinterest. So the question became how to turn this around. How do we reframe the films in this collection so that they're not languishing in the archive, but so that they're activated and so people are inspired to watch and engage with them, to read them, to read people's readings of them, and to deal with them in various ways for various reasons. So the first thing we decided to do was to digitize the collection, to make it accessible for people so that we could actually start to do the research. So this sounds like a simple thing, but as people who are involved in the project know, and as Nova Scotia Archives can tell you, it was not. The machine that we were using to do this is located in Kingston at Queen's University at the Vulnerable Media Lab. So the films needed to be brought to room temperature here, inspected, repaired in some cases, and transported back and forth between Kingston and the archive in Nova Scotia in a number of batches. And there are a few people here tonight who are involved in that schlepping process. One of my crystals is here, David Clark. There are a lot of people involved in making this road trip, accompanying Margaret Perry's work on the way there and back. And a sidebar here, but a really exciting outcome of the project that was announced this week and today was announced by the province, which was super exciting, is that Patty Bannister, our provincial archivist, seeing this happen with the Margaret Perry archive and knowing the value of what it could represent for the region, has purchased for the archive the same equipment, this exact machine that was used at the Vulnerable Media Lab in Kingston. And so now it lives here, the only one east of Montreal. So now delicate film from Atlantic Canada no longer has to travel out of the Atlantic region in order to be digitized. So this has incredible, we're already kind of buzzing with all of the projects that we want to involve here. And the Atlantic Film Cooperative is all trained up on this equipment now and is already starting to do some digitization work. So it's super, super exciting. So this is a huge deal and a game changer for cinema and media history and archival media work in the region. So digitizing the films was the first step to activating the collection, since it made it possible to make the films accessible as a resource for people to access and use. Now, with the launch of the digital collection, people can see these films for themselves without making assumptions about them and what they contain. And here is the resource. And actually, as you leave tonight, please pick up a bookmark that the archives has provided with the web address of this incredible resource. I think I can give you a tour. I think I have a tab up, so I can give you a little bit of a mini tour. Here's the Margaret. Yeah, so all of Margaret Perry's films are digitized there. There's an essay, a couple of essays about her, some curriculum resources that I'll talk about too, that actually ties these films in very specific ways with the Nova Scotia curriculum. So this encourages people to use this archive as a resource in the classroom. So it's super, super exciting. Okay. So seeing the films as a collection allows us to see certain themes across the body of work. Right? So I want to walk you through my observation of one, roads and road building in Perry's films, especially 40s, 50s, 60s, right? Coming out of this period, represent a particular idea of post-war progress in Nova Scotia. They enable the movement of vehicles, which function in these films as metaphors of agency. So whether it's the movement of people, of goods, or of information, the understanding in these films is that roads allow for transportation in which drivers are in control of where they go and the speed at which they go. Right? So whether you're a tourist or whether you're working for the bookmobile, right, you're in control. So in this way, roads are seen to give people in the province more facility and control over both time and space. So Perry's strategic use of Nova Scotia roads functions as a metaphor across her body of work. Even though these are very different films that take on very different topics, this is sort of one of the through lines that we can start to observe by seeing the collection as a whole. And so this represents the complexities of Nova Scotia's drive toward modernization and links with the past. Road imagery features prominently in these films as literal and figurative representations of development and connection. Imagery of highways, bridges, and causeway building document actual changes to Nova Scotia infrastructure that Perry uses to convey significance with broader figurative understandings of Nova Scotia's newfound post-war connectedness to its own regions, so within itself, but also to the rest of Canada and to the world. Perry's aesthetic representation of these changes uses imagery of blasting and forward movement, as well as suggesting new ways of connecting and communicating in the province. Roads function in these films as visual metaphors to signal complex relationships between the province's past and present iterations of itself, and to reflect on possibilities and ambiguities sometimes involved in Nova Scotia's post-war modernization. There's mention throughout this body of work of various highway and bridge building projects that bring about change to the landscape. But perhaps the most arresting visual image that I'll show you and the sort of most visual idea here occurs in the film Road to Celtic from 1956. That depicts the building of the Canso Causeway, a project that, of course, as we know, connects the island of Cape Breton with mainland Nova Scotia. So in this film, the separation of Cape Breton Island from the mainland is characterized as a kind of problem, right, that needs to be resolved, that the building of the causeway has resolved. So imagery of blasting, close-ups of construction, low camera height, and dramatic symphonic music emphasize the power, labor, and engineering prowess that was needed to reshape the landscape, and in doing so, to build a connection between the island and the mainland. So I'm going to show you a clip. Here's a clip from the film that demonstrates the audiovisual representation of this idea. So this is Road to Celtic from 1956.
The separation of Cape Breton from the mainland of Nova Scotia was long a transportation problem. First, canoes and rowboats bridged the gap. Then steam, car, and train ferries supplied the connecting link. As the years passed and villages grew into towns, the islanders dreamt of a more permanent bond between the Celtic Isle and the mainland. In 1951, the dream came to life. The blast that shattered the peaceful quiet of the countryside marked the beginning of one of the world's deepest causeways. The stony face of Cape Porcupine crumbled. Loads of rock and bills splashed into the strait. For nearly 3 years, day and night, winter and summer, the sea swallowed load after load of rock bills. Distance between the mainland and the island grew less and less as 10 million tons of the mountain's face came along the sea floor and up itself.
Yeah, Yeah, so high drama. So what's also important to emphasize here, though, and you can see this when now I can say you can see the rest of the film yourself. You can go home and you can watch it. It's accessible for you. So see for yourself. But I think that what is important to emphasize here is that even though the building of the causeway is characterized as this impressive feat of modern engineering, it's not seen in contrast or to contrast the pre-existing road infrastructure that exists on the island, right? So this is not the causeway bringing progress to the island. The film instead suggests that the island's 300-kilometer long stretch of highway and the Cabot Trail is itself an impressive modern feat of engineering that already exists. So the causeway is not bringing modernity to the island in this film. It instead is seen to forge new links or connections between these two previously separated areas of the province. So the first way that Rhodes and Perry's film depict a sense of progress is in introducing new efficiencies to the pace and scale of human movement, which is aligned with a sense of increased human agency. The second way that roads are aligned with a sense of progress is as they relate to greater efficiencies for the movement of goods and information, both within the province and outward to the world. And so Roads to Reading, as you saw, conveys the message that the Provincial Library's new bookmobile program solves a long-standing problem by using the province's roads to provide democratic access to information to citizens who are dispersed throughout what's characterized in the film as a province that's made up of a series of remote geographical regions. The distribution of information via roads in the form of printed literature is not just about connecting areas of the province, as in Road to Celtic, but about guaranteeing that citizens of the province have access to information as a marker of progress that will give them the ability to fully participate in modern society. In Perry's Marine Highway from 1957, Highway 7, a road that stretches for 129 miles along the province's eastern shore, from Dartmouth to Sherbrooke, is represented as a metaphor for the province itself, connecting ideas of work and leisure, the province's present sense of itself with its past, its folklore, and its oral traditions, and in providing a path to the Halifax harbor and its rail and air transport hubs, its contemporary industrial connections between the province and the rest of the world. I'll show you a little excerpt here from Marine Highway from 1957.
Fishing villages and small farming communities take the place of cities and towns along this highway, and the rhythm of the sea has marked each one with a distinctive pattern of life or industry. One entrance to this marine highway is through Dartmouth, across the harbor from Halifax. Until 1955, only a ferry service linked Halifax with this old town. With the opening of the Angus L. MacDonald Bridge, business and construction surged ahead in Dartmouth. Today, it's a city, and another bridge is to help serve the growing needs of the area. The oil refineries, the marine slip, the CNR terminal point, the floating labs of the Institute of Oceanography, with headquarters at Bedford Basin, an institution that serves all Canada in the field of marine research and hydrography, and Canada's main naval air station at Shearwater. These and the many industries now being drawn to the area are pushing the growth of this new industrial city. Dartmouth has spread the...
Whoops. that's good. It anticipated where I wanted to stop. So according to the logic of this film, to understand Highway 7 is to understand Nova Scotia itself. The road functions as a metonym and a visual representation of the province's sense of itself, its progress and modernization, the links it provides to reminders of its historic past, and its connections to the natural world. In linking the towns and villages on the eastern shore to the Halifax harbor, the argument of the film is that the road extends Nova Scotia's reach, fostering new connections between the province and the world. Perhaps because of the province's post-war developments in road infrastructure were considered to be such powerful metaphors for progress and modernization. Another prominent use of road imagery in Perry's films is the concept of road as a stage. Many films in the Perry collection have a focus on small town seasonal festivals, in which roads and streets function as stages upon which to showcase the region's identity and achievements. In Perry's Apple Land, made in 1946, for example, this film demonstrates the use of a main street in Kentville and uses this as a setting upon which to celebrate the annual Apple Festival. And so I will show you a little clip from this of the road as stage.
Blossom time is festival time in the valley. In blossom time, the valley is very gay. Towns are decorated to match the colors surrounding them. And for 3 full days, there are parades, games, and festivities. On Apple Blossom Day, the children from valley towns gather at Kentville to take part in a parade of their own. For days, they have been decorating doll carriages and bicycles into miniature floats. There will be prizes for the lucky one. But the most exciting event of all is the Grand Parade to escort the chosen Queen of the Apple Blossoms Festival to her coronation.
Okay. So in this film, as in others in the collection, roads are used as stages on which to parade this region's sense of its cultural, industrial, agricultural, artistic, and military achievements. It's not just road building projects in Perry films, but roads themselves that function as metaphors of Nova Scotia's progress and modernization. Viewers in these films are heralded, they're addressed as passengers in cars, as voyeurs of roads in aerial shots, some of which we saw in Marine Highway, aerial shots of roads from above, and as viewers on the side of the road, watching various demonstrations of how these contemporary communication pathways are being built and forging new kinds of spatial and temporal connections within the province, outward to the nation and with the rest of the world. So digitizing the films was the first step to activating this collection, since it made it possible to make the films available as a resource for people to access and use. We could start to identify themes and make connections across the body of work. Now, with the launch of the digital collection, people can see these films for themselves without making assumptions about them and what they contain. They can test readings of them. But the next part of the project, conceptually reframing the collection, not only as government film, but as artistic production, was much more complicated because we didn't have the archive or access to materials that could speak to this. While all the films were at the archive at the beginning of the project, all that existed at the archives about Margaret Perry were 2 photographs, a copy of a National Film Board documentary about Margaret Perry by Sheila Mackenzie, and an essay written by Daryl Varga that was on the archives website. And this is partly, because of the the way in which these films were sort of framed. Films were, they were government productions, so there was an accession of those films at the archive. But, you know, because the work that went into them, they weren't considered to be made by an artist. All of Perry's work materials that she would have produced at the office, those didn't come along with the film. So there was just nothing at the archive for us to explore that aspect of the film's provenance. So we knew some biographical information about the filmmaker at the beginning of the project. We knew that Margaret Perry was born in 1905. She turned to photography and filmmaking at the age of 32, shortly after the death of her husband in a motor vehicle accident while she was pregnant, which left her to make a living for herself and her child. We knew that Perry taught herself photography, but we didn't know that she made a living by selling photos and articles to print publications. We knew peripherally that she worked as a wartime rural circuit projectionist in New Brunswick for the National Film Board of Canada. And we knew that during that time, Perry somehow started to make and exhibit short films that documented aspects of everyday life in New Brunswick, which caught the eye of her local member of parliament, Leonard O'Brien, who mentioned her name in Ottawa to John Grierson, who was director of the National Film Board of Canada. In 1942, we knew that Perry was hired by Grierson and went to Ottawa as one of the National Film Board's first 2 female cinematographers and the only employee from Atlantic Canada at the time. And she served there in a number of roles until she was invited to start up Nova Scotia's Film Bureau in 1945. So she was there for almost 3 years. So other than that, we had nothing. Most of the information that we had, we knew secondhand from Sheila Mackenzie's documentary. And so this meant that aside from reading the films themselves as artistic works, as kind of looking at them through that lens, we really had nothing to go on to tell us about Perry's artistic process or development. So that is when Sharon McDonald came on the scene. Sharon worked as a researcher with me for a couple of years at the beginning of the project, and has, been with me emotionally and spiritually for much longer than that. Sharon was also featured in a Margaret Perry film, Trees in the News. Here's Sharon in Trees in the News about the pulp and paper industry. You can ask her anything about it. And so Sharon just did incredible, formidable work on this project, researched a whole bunch of different areas and found treasure troves all over the place. But one of her incredible contributions was to find Margaret Perry's granddaughter, Leanna Griffith, who is here with us tonight, who lives in Ontario. Leanna had, through her father, as it turns out, an incredible collection of journals, scrapbooks, early films, photographs, slides, and negatives that document Perry's early development as an artist and that articulate this development in Perry's own words, which is so incredible. So for me, when we saw these things, so here's some of the things that we found in the Perry collection. I'm going to show you an excerpt from Bathurst Activities, soon early shooting. Here's Margaret Perry, biographical sketch, right? Margaret Perry saying, my career in filmmaking began rather late in her own words. Absolutely incredible. There's Margaret Perry at the National Film Board. So we have, this is the only picture that I've been able to find of her working there at the Moviola. Right, and some incredible, incredible stuff there. So Sharon and I went to visit Leanna, and together we looked at the collection, and I visited again to study it more closely, and a lot of the artifacts in the collection are now on display until the end of the month at an exhibit at Nova Scotia Archives that I curated along with my colleague, Carla Taunton. As part of this exhibit, we've highlighted a sample of some excerpts from Perry's journals so that people can see what they communicate about her early development as an artist. And these excerpts have been edited into this gorgeous, gorgeous film made by, well, if I double click on that, it's going to make it big. How is this going to, I don't want to mess with this because I'm going to, yeah, okay, I'm just going to keep it there. I'll just leave it playing in the background here so that you can kind of have a look at it. So this beautiful video that animates these excerpts from the diaries that in which Margaret talks about her own development as an artist. This gorgeous video is made by Yifan Liu, a graduate student at NASCAD University. And so I'll just keep it running in the background here as I talk about these journals, so you can get a sense of what it contains. But it's also playing at the archive as part of the exhibit, and hopefully will form part of the web resource as well that we have from Margaret Perry. So these are excerpts from Margaret Perry's journals from 1937 and 1938. So in these journals, we learn that Perry was 6 months pregnant when her husband died, and she had to find a way to support herself. And she writes about this in the journals in this family's collection. She was trained as a stenographer, and she absolutely hated it. She didn't want to be in an office. She wanted a career that would allow her to be out of doors. And it's interesting, across this body of work, there are very, very few scenes that happen indoors. Now, partly this is because of the light levels and that kind of thing. And she's working on her own. She didn't have a lot of lighting equipment to lug around, but so much of the work features the outdoors and nature. So during this time, when she's thinking about what to do with her life, she's taking photographs, right? She says, I want to take this up as a hobby. Then she starts subscribing to magazines about photography. She starts taking photographs. Then she sets up this darkroom. She starts developing themselves. And her journals, more and more, they take on this reflection of her process. She starts to put these pictures in and kind of critique her own work, right? She says, I don't like how this worked. I'm going to try a different, this is what I tried with the formula. I'm going to do something different this time. She sends things away and tries to get advice. There's that amazing self-portrait that I love so much. And then more and more, the journals become less writing, more photography. And in fact, she starts to integrate. She uses the contact sheets, right, with all the little images that she was taking, and she cuts them up. And she begins, you can see here, she begins to sort of integrate them into the body of the text. So she starts using these images to tell stories and sort of integrating that into the prose of her journals. So we get the sense that she's experimenting with putting images and text together in order to tell stories. So I love this. You can kind of see this as like a proto-cinematic development, right? She's sort of editing, or she's writing scripts, thinking about how words and images go together to convey information. So it's fascinating to kind of go back and to find all of this. Perry took a correspondence film course and applied to be a projectionist for one of the National Film Board's rural circuits in New Brunswick. And so from 1940 to 1942, every month she'd receive a shipment of films and show them to local communities. So she'd drive around and set up in church halls and lug this really heavy equipment to do this as well, that we have as part of our exhibit. So this is where she got her early film education, and watching these films from the National Film Board. She then began to make some films on her own, and we were lucky enough to find a few that had still been saved in the family's collection. My favorite is one that's labeled early shooting, and I'll show you. Whoops, I'll show you a little bit of it here. Oh, how can I stop this guy? There we go. Go to this one here. So I'll show you an excerpt from early Bathurst activities, early shooting. I'll just let it run here as it's silent as well. This is how people hung out before the internet, before Netflix. We played badminton in the house. So, I love this film for many, many reasons. This is a film that shows small glimpses of everyday life, winter scenes in Bathurst, New Brunswick. Notably in this piece, we see Perry starting to experiment with a few different things, in that, the kind of indoor kind of sporting thing we can see. Yes, I want to show you this. You can see she's experimenting with figuring out screen direction and continuity conventions. She's really following the birdie a little bit in that badminton a little bit too much. When she developed that, I'm sure she looked at that and kind of corrected. But this is really fascinating fascinating in this early thing. She's starting to experiment with in-camera editing. So stopping and starting the camera, setting up different shots in order to tell a story. So here's someone who's getting ready to go skiing, and we start with this like super extreme close-up of a boot that's being laced up. Right, and then this other, so showing these different angles, but you know, this wouldn't have been edited after the fact. This is stopping and starting the camera, right? Sort of premeditating, thinking about the shots that she wants in advance and then going out and getting them. So this is like a really, really cool artifact of some of the, you know, her learning how to put, you know, how to tell a story using different shots and views of the scene. So the contribution of this record of Perry's early cinematic development as an artist is really invaluable. And how rare is it to have an artist articulate the motivation for and to chronicle their early development in such great detail? And it was out there the whole time, right? We only had to find it. The family archive also includes, as I showed you, reflections on her early, on her career, on her retirement, right? So this piece, there are a few pieces that do that in her own words. So being able to access this family collection has been absolutely essential in filling in some of the gaps and deepening what we know about Margaret Perry's biography and development as an artist. And this makes it possible for researchers to connect the films, the collection of films that she made with the artist for the first time. And I'm happy to say that some of this material in this collection will be staying at Nova Scotia Archives after the exhibit is finished, so that future researchers will be able to continue to do that. They'll be able to continue to access it in order to learn about Perry's development in connection with these films. Another area that we needed to research in order to activate and reframe the collection as Perry's artworks was to gather information about her filmmaking practice in mid-career. So at the beginning of this project, we knew very little about how she actually made the films that we were watching. But by locating files at the National Film Board and in the Crawley Fawcett Library and Archives Canada, we've started to crack that code. Perry worked at the National Film Board from 1942 to 45 on a number of projects as an editor, producer, director, and as one of the National Film Boards, as I mentioned, one of the two female cinematographers who began at the same time. National Film Board production files on the scripts she worked on contain shot lists, which demonstrate her shooting method, and cutting scripts indicating her creative process. There are budgets and memos that tell us what the films cost and how long Perry was on location and what she was instructed to shoot. And this, I love this letter from Dallas Jones, you know, telling Margaret Perry when she's on location, "I'm sorry that the spring season is so late in the Maritimes." Yeah, Dallas Jones, like, yeah, we're with you. She can't get her foliage shot, so here's what you do instead, right? He's giving her this, this advice. In this telegram sent to Perry on the road, she receives aesthetic advice about how to perk up the drab exteriors of fishing canneries that she was shooting. Bill McDonald advises her to concentrate on characterization of personnel, indicate intercommunity cooperation between old people and young people and old timers, and some racial comparisons. Regarding drab cooperatives exteriors, he advises her, possibly you can avoid this by having large and small group activities of people strongly in the foreground, lots of action, and drab background will not be noticed excessively. But you can see that she's actually using these things, like these are sort of like hot tips that she's integrating into her artistic practice. And if you look at these films, right, you can actually see people in colorful sweaters in the foregrounds, right, in front of canneries or these fishing villages. Very, very interesting. So despite the fact that the Nova Scotia Film Bureau was a government department, as I mentioned, there were no records of its operations deposited at the archives, at least not personal ones. Margaret Perry's personal ones weren't deposited. So interviews that we've been able to do with co-workers and photographs in the Perry's personal collections, as well as her papers, give us important information about how she made films, including this one incredible photograph of the Bureau's production office that shows the Bureau's setup and the equipment that she used. used. Perry loved to edit. That was her favorite part of filmmaking, but she didn't have super fancy equipment. And this image is incredible for just kind of seeing her process, for showing her process of clipping shots to the wall, using these clothes pegs and sort of moving them around as part of the editing process. So we can kind of learn a lot about how she worked by seeing photographs like this. And recently we've happily discovered, thanks to my colleague Charles Ackland at Concordia University, that Crawley Productions, the post-production company that collaborated with Perry on her films, has a record of all of Perry's correspondence. So this treasure trove of Crawley fonts at Library and Archives Canada gives us new and very detailed insight into Perry's cinematic process. And so here's, an example. And it's incredibly personal communication too. She has this relationship with Sally McDonald and a couple of other people who work in producer services, and they sort of, chit chat about their lives, but also like very incredible detail about these would have been the emails of the day, talking about what technically had to be done to the films. And so here, she writes to Sally. She says, it's 7:30 p.m. and I haven't even had supper yet, but I want to get this film out of my hair tonight. At the moment, I don't even feel I have a film. Have changed it considerably, think it adds up better than it did, but I'm not too happy about the fall sequence. It's short compared to the others, and the birds are not so good. In fact, when dupe is made, if you think that the shot of bird marked on continuity sheet page 1, reel 2 is short, incredible detail like this. And so we just have folders and files and files and files and files of the stuff to go to. So it's an incredible, incredible contribution. So the archive really gives her gives us a real sense of her creative thought process, and also some of the things that Sally was telling her not to do. Sally was like, please don't cut the film to the bone again, Margaret. You love to edit, like leave something there. So it's interesting too, from Sally's point of view, learning about Perry's process and what she was working on. So the process of activating the Perry Film Collection involved bringing together Perry's 50 digitized films with 3 collections: the Family's Archive, NFB Archives, and Library and Archives Canada, some of the materials that live there. It's in bringing together all of this material that's made it possible to reframe and activate the Nova Scotia Film Bureau collection as a collection of Margaret Perry films. And this has made it possible to further activate the collection. We now have enough contextual information that we could develop and release teachers' guides to link these films with the Nova Scotia curriculum. And to suggest how they might be used in a very, pragmatic way in the classroom as a resource. So we've developed teachers' guides for elementary, secondary, and post-secondary classrooms. We also know enough about her as an artist that we can start to think about her aesthetic. And at Archive, Counter Archive, one of the methods that we're using for research is to have artists and researchers work together to learn from each other in what they produce. And it's been incredible. It's been an incredible opportunity to learn about Perry's filmmaking aesthetic through the eyes of media artist David Clark's incredible piece that's running now at the Chase Gallery at Nova Scotia Archives until the end of the month. David's video installation, Woman with a Movie Camera, repurposes footage from the many films in the Perry collection. Individual shots in the films have been made into loops and organized across 18 home movie screens to focus on rhythms and visual compositions in Perry's work. So this process brings Perry's filmmaking into conversation with Vertov's 1929 famous cinematic experiment, Man with a Movie Camera, a film that shares an interest in aspects and, detailed aspects of life, everyday life, like Margaret Perry's work. David says, created a foundation for further cinematic exploration. This exploded view of Margaret Perry's work strips away the soundtrack and allows us to concentrate on Perry's remarkable eye and her remarkable aesthetic. So I'll show you, this is a little bit, this is a great video by the Atlantic International Film Festival that they made for us. So you can just kind of see David's piece very, very quickly. There it is. You got to go back. You got to go to the archive and see it. And really sit there. I mean, it's incredible. It's it's over an hour long. It's got these incredible chapters, but it's just a wonderful, wonderful piece to to really start to appreciate Perry's cinema aesthetic. So this, along with an interpretive exhibit that you see here, curated by Carla Taunton and myself, is on display at the archive in the lobby until the end of the month. And after 5 years of work, it's been tremendous this week to see the archives, the film festival, artists, scholars, makers working together to activate this existing archival collection, and in doing so, give it new life. So I think that as researchers, we always hope to activate archival collections whenever we pay attention to something and shine a light on it. But what if the purpose of our research is not just to make an argument about something, about how something could or should be framed, but to create the conditions around which the thing that we're writing about can also be viewed, be reviewed, be framed by others going forward? That's a different kind of project. And I think that's kind of a game changer for research. Thinking this way, we're not just writing about something, we're also thinking about how we can share the thing that we're writing about. Increasingly, I think this work of activating and mediating collections that we care about is becoming part of our responsibility as researchers, and one that we should all take up as part of our work. So please check out the Margaret Perry collection of films. Pick up a bookmark on your way out that has the web address where you can see them all. Activate and engage with them in your own way. That's what they are there for. So thank you so much for your attention tonight. It's been wonderful to have the opportunity to share our process with you. We're celebrating the launch of the archive this week, but this really is just the beginning. We're only getting started. So it's great that you are here to help us launch it. So thank you so much.